Welcome back, scholars. Today we are studying the work of one William Shakespeare, the man with the most famous receding hairline in all of English literature, also the greatest playwright. The author William Shakespeare was the son of a glove maker who married at the tender age of 18 to an older woman. Anne Hathaway was 26, and she was also 3 months pregnant with their first child. He lived in Stratford, went into the family business, but Stratford was a tough town for a poet, as it was a working-class town of about 2,000 people. Shakespeare's father, John, held a lot of different jobs. At one point, he got paid to drink beer. I kid you not. He was the ale taster. The son of a tenant farmer, John Shakespeare was nothing if not upwardly mobile. He arrived in Stratford upon Avon and began dabbling in various trades, selling leather goods, wool, malt, and corn. In 1556, he was appointed the borough's official ale tester, meaning he was responsible for inspecting the bread and malt liquors. And the next year, he took another big step up the social ladder by marrying Mary Arden, the daughter of an aristocratic farmer who happened to be his father's former boss. John later became a moneylender and held a series of municipal positions, serving for some time as the mayor of Stratford. In the 1570s, he fell into debt and ran into legal problems for reasons that remain unclear. Shakespeare's parents probably were illiterate, and his children almost certainly were. Nobody knows for sure, but it's quite likely that John and Mary Shakespeare never learned to read or write, as was often the case with people of their standing in the Elizabethan era. Some have argued that John's civic duties would have required some basic literacy, but in any event, he always signed his name with his mark, not his signature. William, on the other hand, attended Stratford's local grammar school, where he mastered reading, writing, and Latin. His wife and their 2 children, who lived to adulthood, Susanna and Judith, are thought to have been illiterate, though Susanna could scrawl her signature. To the dismay of his biographers, William Shakespeare disappears from the historical record between 1585, when his twins are born, to about 1592. And we only know of 1592 because Robert Greene, the playwright, dismissed him as an upstart crow. Well, so much for Robert Greene. The insult suggests he'd already made a name for himself in the London stage by then, and the newly married father and future literary icon of those 7, what did he do during those 7 lost years? Historians have speculated he worked as a school teacher, may have studied law, traveled across the continent of Europe. According to one 17th century account, he fled his hometown after poaching a deer from a local politician's estate. Led quite the interesting life there for a playwright, as you would. William Shakespeare is believed to influence the English language more than any other writer in history, coining, or at the very least popularizing, terms and phrases that regularly crop up in English today in everyday conversation. Examples include the word fashionable from Troilus and Cressida, sanctimonious from Measure for Measure, eyeball from A Midsummer Night's Dream, lackluster from As You Like It, and expressions foregone conclusion from Othello, in a pickle from The Tempest, wild goose chase from Romeo and Juliet, and one fell swoop from Macbeth. He's also credited with inventing the names Olivia, Miranda, Jessica, and Cordelia, which have become common over the years, as well as such other names as Nerissa and Titania, which haven't. Some people think that Shakespeare was a fraud. They ask, how did a provincial commoner who had never gone to college or school outside of Stratford become one of the most prolific and eloquent writers in history? Even early in his career, Shakespeare was spinning tales that displayed an in-depth knowledge of international affairs, European capitals, history, as well as familiarity with the court and high society. For this reason, some theorists have suggested that one or several authors wishing to conceal their identity, such as use this person of William Shakespeare as a front, such as Edward de Vere, Francis Bacon, Chris Marlowe, and Mary Sidney Herbert. There's even a recent book that suggests that Shakespeare was a black Jewish woman. However, most scholars and literary historians remain skeptical about this hypothesis. although many suspect Shakespeare sometimes collaborated with other playwrights, and we know this to be a fact. However, a few years ago, a group of scientists got together and entered Shakespeare's collected works into a database, along with those of his contemporaries. The closest writer of Shakespeare's time that came to matching was Queen Elizabeth, and they're pretty sure it's fairly unlikely that she was the true author of his works. Here's their take on it. Was the Earl of Oxford the true Shakespeare? A computer-aided analysis by Ward Elliott and Robert Valenza, Claremont McKenna College, Columbia Avenue, Claremont, California. Our conclusion from the clinic was that Shakespeare fit within a fairly narrow, distinctive profile. Under our best tests, if his poems were written by committee, it was a remarkably consistent committee. If they were written by any claimants we tested, it was a remarkably consistent claimant. If they were written by the Earl of Oxford, he must have, after taking the name of Shakespeare, have undergone several stylistic changes of type and magnitude unknown in Shakespeare's accepted works. And as for feminine endings and opening lines, he must have somehow found a way to carry on trends which are well known in Shakespeare's plays for almost a decade after his own death. These are not easy assumptions to make. We do not claim to have said the last word on the subject, nor to have solved the Shakespeare authorship mystery. But if it strains credulity to suppose that Will Shakespeare, the Stratford grain dealer, could have written Shakespeare's poems and plays, it also strains credulity to suggest that people like Oxford, with entirely different stylistic idiosyncrasies from Shakespeare, could have been the true authors of his poems and plays. Ward Elliott, Robert Valenza, Claremont College. So there you have it. Shakespeare, more than likely, was Shakespeare. Ordinary genius is a possibility. And too, in our time, the education system was different back then. Whereas we now teach remedial English in college, he would have studied Greek, Latin, the classics, plus whatever plays were popular and what stories were popular at that day. Now, he probably began his journey as a hostler. We know at one point he left Stratford and Avon and left the family there to go and seek his fortune on the stage in London. He probably began, as I said, he began his career likely as a hostler, which is kind of a parking attendant for horses. He would watch the horses, and he would, essentially was a glorified parking attendant on an Elizabethan era. But he was also an actor. He loved the stage, and he revolutionized the way that theater is produced. Back in Shakespeare's day, he probably would have had, as his father was the mayor of Stratford, he would have been privy to viewing the local plays that came through on the circuit. But these were different kind of plays. A lot of them focused on wordplay. There was a group called the University Wits, featuring men like Thomas Kidd and Robert Greene and others, whose focus was more on wordplay and jokes. Or there were morality plays, where a character named Christian, or Youth, is lured away into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or the debauchery of the day, and had to be lured back by a character named Virtue. You can see what they're doing there, right? Which brings us to his play, Hamlet. Now, Hamlet was released about 1601, or at least first performed at about 1601. And what makes this play unique and rather special, and perhaps his most popular, most famous work, was the bit of the background. We know that Hamlet and his wife Anne Hathaway had twins, Judith and Hamnet. We know that Hamnet died at the age of 11. And not long before the play Hamlet was produced, Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, passed away as well. So here we have the story of a grieving son trying to avenge and seek vengeance for his dead father, written by a grieving father and a grieving son. Hamnet, as we know from the recent film Hamlet, as we know from the recent film Hamnet, was interchangeable with Hamlet. We know that it was premiered and played at the Globe Theater, that he was part of the program of the Lord Chamberlain's men, later the King's men, and it occurred in the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Now, Queen Elizabeth, Queen Bess as she was known, had ruled for a good almost 50 years. She was reaching the end of her reign. She was getting older and feeling a bit frail and surrounded by enemies. She'd also become somewhat paranoid. It was dangerous to be a playwright. The playwright Thomas Kidd was arrested and tortured. Her former friend and compatriot, the Earl of Essex, was executed. With the Queen's health in decline and her being surrounded by enemies both in the court and outside, there was a sense of turmoil, unrest, and Shakespeare played to this a bit because what the British were concerned about, the loyal subjects and the people of England were worried about, was what is to become of our nation once our queen is gone. She was known as the Virgin Queen. She had left no heir, never married, never bore children. And so there's this sense of tension and concern. What is to become of us? Will we fall to France? Will we be Spanish subjects? Who will succeed our queen once she is gone? And as I said, there were many people who were trying to hasten that end so that they could perhaps come and overthrow it. And so, for this reason, and because of the troubles with writers and playwrights at this time, we have a play set not in England, but in Denmark, following the sudden death of a monarch. Now, William Shakespeare was one of Queen Elizabeth's favorite playwrights. He had often come and performed his plays at the castle with his group, the Lord Chamberlain's men. And so this probably afforded him some measure of liberty that he might not otherwise have, but even so he had to be careful. Hence the setting of Denmark as opposed to England. And as our play opens, we have a couple of soldiers keeping watch outside of the Castle Elsinore. Now what happens in this first scene? The two soldiers are standing on watch. They're sentinels, essentially. And they're doing what soldiers typically do. They're talking about the weather and being tired. One has come to relieve the other and says, "Thank you for this relief. I'm heartsick. I need to get home." And they begin, too, discussing an apparition that they've seen. Something is amiss. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, as Hamlet will tell us later. What is going on is the recently deceased king has made an appearance, or at least his ghost has. He stalks about the place, dressed in armor, and we know immediately that something is wrong because he is dressed for war, not for his eternal reward. And so they believe, the sentries believe that, well, this must mean that we're on the cusp of invasion. What happened was, during the latter part of King Hamlet's life, he and the King of Norway contended for in a duel to see who was the stronger person, the stronger leader, the more powerful. And King Hamlet prevailed on Norway. King Fortinbras was his name, and he died. And so as a result, Fortinbras's heirs ceded Norwegian territories to Denmark. Now, with King Hamlet dead, and with the passing of the monarch, the kingdom being in some measure of disarray, young Fortinbras is seeking to recover his territory and avenge his father. However, Denmark is not without a monarch. King Claudius, pictured here from the Branagh version, has very quickly, less than a month after Hamlet's father's death, has married Queen Gertrude. Yep. This goes against the laws of God and man, if you pay attention to the book of Leviticus. And here we have Hamlet. Hamlet, who has been at school in Wittenberg. Now, Wittenberg did not exist at the time. The Wittenberg University, rather, did not exist at the time of the play. But it would during Shakespeare's time. And this is well known to his audience because Wittenberg, the college at Wittenberg, is where Martin Luther nailed the theses to the door of the church there. Right? So now, Queen Elizabeth, her father had been a Protestant king and founded the Church of England, Henry VIII. And she is carrying on her father's legacy here by forcing the Catholics underground and taking her place at the head of the Church of England. So he is playing to his audience and to his chief patron here. So here we have Claudius, who has ascended the throne and has rather creepily taken his sister-in-law for his wife. And everybody is wondering why Hamlet is upset. Now, Hamlet, missing his father, still grieving heartily for him, has been called to court with the rest of them. Of course, he's been called back to school for back from school for the funeral of his father, and then the sudden and hasty marriage of his mother to his uncle. And his uncle and his mom want everything to just be hunky-dory. Hamlet somehow is supposed to just accept this and look upon his uncle as now his father. You see the problem, right? Of course you do. Who wouldn't? It would take a blind man to miss this. And so it's not hard to see why the ghost of Hamlet Sr. is stalking the parapets in his armor, yes? Now, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but in the courtyard of the castle, now I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let's go back to the courtyard of the castle, where we have two sentries keeping watch, and they're discussing the appearance of Hamlet Sr. We have Marcellus, and we have a man named Horatio. Horatio, however, is not a guard, but a scholar, as it turns out, a friend of Hamlet's from Wittenberg. And Marcellus is chiding him for his belief that what they're seeing is just an illusion, the product of their imaginations. Their grief and their concern, their worry over the potential attack from Norway has, caused them to look upon this fellow and mistake swamp gas or some such for the ghost of Hamlet Sr. But then he appears, walking in armor, and they call to it. They ask him to speak, tell us what's going on. Why are you here? What have you come for? And they call on Horatio to speak to him because scholars, in the thinking of the time, can speak to ghosts, to apparitions. There's the belief that, perhaps he has left some treasure here and his soul can't rest until he reveals to someone that where his treasure is that he's hidden within the earth. Others think that he, as we stated before, think he's here to warn of an attack from Norway. But the truth is somewhat more disturbing and sinister, as we'll find out shortly. Now, flashback to the courtyard, or rather the throne room of the castle. We have a grand ceremony where the king and queen, the new king and queen, are attended by their courtiers. And Claudius is discussing his new marriage and celebrating. Now Laertes comes to him and he says, "Oh, what can I do for you, Laertes?" Laertes being a courtier, and he engages in a bit of a flex with him here. He says, letting Laertes know that, I am in charge here and I can decide your fate and what you want to do. I can give you leave to go, or I can force you to stay. And he says, my dread lord, I would like to go back to France. I've come here to celebrate your wedding, but I would like to go back as it suits me much. He says, all right, great. Well, what did your father say? And his father, Polonius, who we'll find out is a very wordy and ostentatious fellow, says, he has wrung my approval from me with much complaining and much talking. Yes. So Claudius says, all right, be on your way, and God be with you. Go safely. And then they turn their attention to Hamlet. Hamlet, who in this scene is dressed all in black. Dressed in black because he is mourning. And Claudius says, "Why are you so upset, Hamlet? Why are you still grieving? No, it's been a month since his father, his beloved father, has passed away, and his mother has gone and married his uncle." Why indeed? Of course he's upset. Why wouldn't he be? And so, he says, "Look, this is unmanly. Come on. I know you want to go back to Wittenberg, but I'd rather you stay here. We want to have you here close to the castle." So, he has a number of reasons to be upset, but most of all is because he is grieving his father, and he can't understand why his mother would so quickly pass away, would move on and marry his uncle. Now, the problem being here, it was assumed that Hamlet Sr. died of natural causes, or, misadventure, more or less. It is thought that he was bitten by a snake while he was napping in his garden. And so the ceremony ends, everyone walks out, leaving Hamlet alone, and he introduces, we are given his first soliloquy here, where he discusses his plot and his sorrow, and he says, why is my mother married so quickly? How heartbroken he is. He talks about it, and he says, I wish this flesh would just melt away. I would do away with myself, but God has spoken out against suicide when he says he has set his canon against self-harm. That's what he's talking about. I would end my own life, but it is a mortal sin to commit suicide, and therefore I would go to hell. And so he's in the midst of this and is grieving and sorrowing and still in utter shock that his mother so quickly has forgotten his father, who, by his own words, is so much better, so much a more wonderful personage. He says, compares him to Hyperion, the god of the sun, and he compares his uncle Claudius to a satyr. A satyr being, of course, the half-man, half-goat creature from Greek mythology. Now, goats were at the time seen as rapacious, overly sexual, kind of gross and unkind. And Hyperion, of course, the god of the sun, the father of Phoebus and Selene, the gods of the sun and the moon. And he says, why didn't she mourn longer? She married my uncle after just a month. My father's brother, no more like a father than I to Hercules. Okay, and so he has a bit of self-esteem trouble too. One of the things that we'll see about Hamlet, he's indecisive, and at one point his father's ghost comes and says, "Hey, look, you need to remember your purpose. You need to remember what you've been set apart for, what the mission I've sent you off on." So in the midst of this, Horatio, his friend, and Marcellus come in and tell him, "Hey, we need to tell you something. We have seen your father. We have seen his ghost, and I think you need to come and witness this." The scene changes to Laertes talking with his sister Ophelia. Now, Ophelia and Hamlet are in love. They have been dating, as it were, or at least spending a lot of time together, dating on an Elizabethan sort of scale. And Laertes, getting ready to go to France and, and ply his trade and have fun like young men would do at the time, is advising his beloved sister to be careful. Watch out for Hamlet, he says. He's a young prince. He's young and he's crazy about you now, but his life isn't necessarily his own. He may not have that much say in whom he will marry and what he will do. You must be careful not to yield up your virtue to him, or otherwise you'll be ruined. Not only will you be ruined, but we will be too. Our family name is, because the reputation of the daughter or the children also reflected on the family. And so he is very affectionate, very kind to her. He's very concerned about the safety of his sister and her feelings. And she says, okay, well, thank you, I'll take that. But hey, you make sure that you don't act like a libertine, too. Don't be like the hypocritical preacher who tells his congregation to do one thing and then does something else himself. So you watch yourself over there in London, young man, because I know what kind of things go on there. And he says, yes, of course. At this point, Polonius enters, and bidding his son farewell, he gives him some really great fatherly advice. He says, look, give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Thy friends thou hast with their adoption, grapple them to thy soul with steel. Do not dull thy palm with entertainment. That is, don't throw your money around too easily. Of each new unfledged comrade, beware of entrance to a quarrel. Bear that the opposed may beware of thee. Right? Be formidable. Don't start fights. Don't get into fights, but be severe enough that people won't want to fight you either. Dress well, but not too ostentatiously, not too fancily. Give every man your ear and very few your voice. Listen more than you say. And he says, above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night to day, thou canst be false with no man. Which is ironic, because later on he will send a fellow to spy on his son, make sure he's living properly, but he tasks him with telling lies about him. And here's the thing: Polonius is a bit of a social climber. He's shifty. He is deceptive, and this tells us a lot about the Danish court at the time. So, with one last word to his sister, he says, remember what I've told you. And he says, I will keep it. She says, I will keep it in my heart, and you will have the key. And so he exits. His father says, hurry along, they're waiting for you, it's time for you to go. And then, and it's acted out rather cruelly in Brano's version. Polonius is a bit harsh with Ophelia. And he's a concerned father, but he's also a bit rougher with her than he is Laertes. And this kind of makes sense because of the role and the place of women in society at the time. He says, so, I hear you've been spending a lot of time with Hamlet these days, and he's been asking for your company, and you've been pretty generous with it. He goes, you need to be careful. You need to watch out for this guy, because he's a young prince, he's dashing and brash, and he may tell you things that make promises that he can't keep later. He goes, look, I want you to stop seeing him, because he is a threat. He is a threat to our family. He is a threat to you and your reputation. And if you give yourself to him, he will ruin you. There's no easy way to put it. Men can fool around. They can have a lot of lovers, and it won't harm their reputation. In fact, it may even improve it. But women are seen as different, somehow more perfect, and they have to be pure and righteous in ways that men can get away with. And so the scene ends with Ophelia acquiescing to her father. Now at this point the scene shifts to the courtyard, and Hamlet and his cohorts are heading out to trying to catch up with the ghosts and see what he will say. The king, Claudius, still in his cups and still celebrating his recent marriage, has decided that he will have the cannon sound every time he takes a drink. And so it sounds like thunder. And this, of course, startles Horatio and Marcellus. And he says, what is going on? And he goes, oh, well, the king is carousing tonight, and he's firing the cannon every time he drinks. And he says, well, is this common? He goes, well, it's a tradition more observed in the breach than in the observance. And suddenly the ghost of Hamlet Sr. comes to them. Okay. Now, herein lies the problem. Marcellus and Horatio are terrified that perhaps this is not, in fact, a purgatorial spirit, a spirit who has been sent to give Hamlet his mission and send him on his way, but rather a goblin. The ghost beckons Hamlet to follow him. And they say, no, don't do it. He's going to lead you perhaps to the cliff or into danger. You're going to get killed. And he says, no, go on, I'll follow thee. And he threatens. They try to hold him back. And he draws his sword and he said, I'll make a ghost of the man who tries to stop me. And so they follow after him. And so he leads them out into the outside of the courtyard where he can discuss with them and tell them what's happening. Finally, he chases them for a while. He says, "I'll go no farther. Tell me what is going on." He tells them, "I'm your father's spirit. I was murdered by your uncle." And he said, and here's the problem. When he was killed without the chance to receive her last rites or to forgive or ask forgiveness for his sins. He was unable to make restitution for his sins. And so we have this very Catholic ghost in an otherwise Protestant play. Because what he's having to do is, for a time, he has to suffer the torments of fire to burn away the sins of his life, of his mortal life, because he was killed without giving the chance to confess or be shriven. And he says, look, here's what happened. Everybody says that I was stung by a snake. Well, the snake that stung my ear now sits on my throne. What he tells me is, but the noble youth, the serpent that did sting thy father's ear, now wears his crown. He goes, aye, that incestuous, that adulterate beast. While I was sleeping in my garden as my everyday tradition, he slipped in and poured in the porches of mine ear the milk of the Hebanon plant. It's a Hebanon poison. He said it had the effect of a poison causing me to break out into scabs, and he died. And again, the problem here is he went to his grave unshriven. He could not confess his sins. He couldn't make restitution for them. And he is a purgatorial spirit rather than a ghost or a demon. He warns Hamlet, he goes, look, you have to take vengeance for me. It's up to you. He goes, you have to take revenge for me. You have to get justice and vengeance by killing your uncle. But your mother, leave her to God and to her conscience. And he agrees. He says, yes, I will do that. He says, here's what I'll do. He brings Marcellus and Horatio to him, and he says, here, swear on my sword. And he holds up the hilt of it so that the shape of the hilt of an English sword, or really a European sword, is shaped like the cross. So he's here, swear on the cross that you will be true to me, that you will keep my secret here. And then from beneath the stage, you hear Hamlet's father say, swear. And this is Hamlet, or this is rather Shakespeare, playing with the conventions of theater at the time. He's doing special effects, essentially, and it's kind of great. And he says, all right, we will keep your secret. He goes, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put on an antic disposition. I'm going to pretend to be crazy, because no one takes a crazy man seriously. So I can figure out who the major players are, and I can easily get my revenge on my uncle this way. And so the play ends with Hamlet set forth on his mission of vengeance.